Welcome to Spiritual Studies session 36. This is on the Tree of Life, otherwise known as Kabbala or Kabbalism. It's been a reoccurring theme in esoteric religions and in this course in particular, bringing up the Tree of Life, the Tree of Life, the Tree of Life, as it was originally seen in shamanism, being the connecting line between the upper, the lower, and the middle realm. So this has roots, pun intended, all the way back to the earliest religion or religions or spirituality of humanity. And likewise, we see it spread across different paganisms as well of the ancient world, most notably Yggdrasil of the Norse pantheon. So this significance of the tree, and no question of, the notoriety of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life as it's been coined in Christianity, Judaism, henceforth. But today we're taking the approach of understanding, and mind you, there's no way we can reach a full understanding, but giving some context as to what Kabbalah is, what this symbol means as maybe even more of a focus, and how it's been understood by cultures or by traditions other than Kabbalism as well. So to start, I do, and trust me, we will get into some real heady, nitty-gritty territory here, but I want to start with giving some context as to the history of Kabbalism, and doing that through talking about the books of Kabbalism. So there's a cycle here, and then there are five main meat and potatoes texts. So the names to remember are Adam, Abraham, Rashbi, Ari, and Baal, or Baal. And again, I'm going to always preface, as I always do in these courses, I read, I don't hear a lot of these things, so my pronunciations, especially of Hebrew, cannot be relied upon. So the first book we have here is the Book of Raziel, which is the Book of Adam, otherwise known. And this is a book that was said to have been given to Adam upon leaving the Garden of Eden by the angel or archangel Raziel. So this one is the most coded of them all, per se. This one gives mention to what would become the Sephirot or the Sephiroths later on, and gives the base work to what would later develop as Kabbalism. So you can think of this as a kind of foundation, and that the teachings of this have been passed down through patriarchs with the assistance of these different archangels. However, you have scholars that would look at this and say that this book only appears in the 13th century. But yet again, that could be questioned by Kabbalists through the art of oral tradition, because just like in many spiritualities that we've observed, it's not that the book is the religion, right? It's that these things were told to each other through lineage, through storytelling. And through this, it would seem more through initiations. But anyhow, the one that comes next and helps to congeal Kabbalism more is Abraham's Book of Creation. And so then this one is touted to Abraham, of course, very familiar name. The Book of Formation, the Book of Creation, the Yetzirah, the Sefer Yetzirah, and Yetzirah literally meaning formation. And this gives more credo as to some of the terms that will be used later on in this talk, the 10 different numbers of the Sephiroth, naming them as 10, the 22 different letters, how the different Hebrew letters are associated with the Sephiroth, the 10 numbers, the 22 letters, the 3 mother letters, the 7 double letters, the 12 simple or elemental letters, This gets into gematria territory. This gets into coding territory. But the mention of how the universe was created by the God of Israel and the 32 wondrous ways, or the 32 paths, which again we'll talk on later. So right away you can start to see that it's giving more meat to the bones that were already established in the book of Adam. Then we move to Rashbi's Zohar, and the Zohar is really the, and I've used the word a few times now, but foundational work. So the Zohar is really the kind of staple of Jewish mysticism. And this is the one that I actually have some acquaintance with. This takes the form of more allegory. It takes the form of storytelling. But as with all of these texts, if you talk to a Kabbalist, it's not what's happening superficially, what you read on the surface. It's what is encoded into it. If you can apply the right understanding, you can see what's happening on the esoteric level. So as someone who is unfamiliar or uninitiated to this tradition, you would read it at its face value and you would not see what's really going on. As a matter of fact, you would fundamentally misunderstand what's going on. And this same logic is applied to the Old Testament, that it's not about what is happening on face value. It's actually something of a very different level of understanding. That's one of the best ways I can put it. But the Zohar is yet again adding to this mystical cosmogeny, a commentary on the fundamental nature of matter, of mystical psychology. Yet again, commenting on the origin of the universe, the purpose of life, the purpose of everything, really. I mean, and this pathway between the ego and the light of God, or awakening, or whatever, insert whatever words of divinity you want to have here. Um, and so, yet again, there is what is told through Kabbalism in contradiction to what is told through scholars, because yet again, there's a fundamental barrier between these two understandings of what Kabbalism is. Kabbalists aren't looking at this from a purely intellectual standpoint, and it's not to put them down at all, but it's just to say that to approach these topics with a purely intellectual perspective is actually filtering out what's really going on. I hope this will become more apparent later, but this was written in Aramaic, which is also the same biblical language as was the book of Daniel and the book of Ezra and in the Talmud. So from the scholarly perspective, they question why it was written in this. They think that it was done after the fact. And yet again, they say that they don't see it appearing until it was in Spain in the 13th century. But yet again, we have to talk about the histories of oral tradition. But many stories go along with this Zohar that go beyond what I'm speaking, including Shimon hiding in a cave for 13 years studying the Torah, and this kind of hermetic or hermitage that comes along with being a Jewish mystic in this time of history. And there's a lot to say about that, but that's not what this is about. So what comes next is Ari's tree of life. So this is where we see the coining of the term tree of life that people now use to describe this symbol of Kabbalism. And this is what's really codifying or putting this symbol into definition, or gosh, I'm trying to walk on eggshells here, but is considered, this work and this rabbi is considered the father or the progenitor or the concreter of contemporary Kabbalah. And each step along the way here, we're seeing that it's becoming more and more accessible. So you're noticing quite the tonal shift when we're talking about Ari's tree of life. So this is where it's starting to codify more. This is where it starts to be more accessible. Um, and of himself, Luria is his name, uh, of himself wrote very little, but his lectures and his notes and everything that could be collected by his students were put together into the 8 volumes that would be the Tree of Life. Um, and then this was later published in 1772. But he himself lived in the 15th century. So there's that step. And then finally, we're coming to Ball's The Ladder. And this is the most contemporary reference of the 5 books that are the meat and potatoes of Kabbalism. It's called The Ladder Through Translation, the author of The Ladder. This was his kind of magnum opus. And this is what really pushed Kabbalah to the masses. And this gives more precision, structural foundation, and organization to understanding this whole tree of things, this whole, I don't even know how to say it properly, multidimensionness of this, giving it more clarification, clarifying how to study this properly. Because as you can see, even just by looking at the symbol, you can notice that there's quite a mystique about it. It brings a very astute, distinct curiosity with it, that it has many inbound implications. Um, so these were the 5 marks of what could constitute the study of Kabbalism. And we're talking about the claim as it's been made by the Kabbalists themselves, that the book of Adam goes back over 5,000 years, that the book of Abraham goes back over 3,000 years, that the Zohar goes back almost 2,000 years, that Ari brought his, codification of the tree of life 700 years ago, and that Baal was commenting on this and really giving this this growing mass distinction and detail 100 years ago. So, in this respect, in the esoteric understanding of things, they would say that all of these individuals, all of these authors are of the same reincarnation, that slowly this truth has been unveiled as the collective consciousness has gained. And that it's only in very recent times that this sort of knowledge, this tradition, has been made accessible to the people of the world, that they're talking about it openly. And so you see that the knowledge and the philosophy has been slowly unraveled through time. And the argument here isn't that it's been made up over time, it's that it's unraveling over time, that this is an objective truth that is slowly being provided, slowly being elaborated upon as time continues. So I want to mention straight out again that the real understanding of these books is tied to Jewish esotericism and mysticism, to the fact of gematria, which is applying numbers to understanding the inner codes of what have been written. And then there's what is designated as the language of roots and branches, which is another way to decode what these writings are actually saying. So there's some real mystique and real mystery when it comes to approaching this stuff. And everything that I'm talking about here, these books, these texts, are available to the public. They're actually online for free to the public. And I'll put links after this. But when it comes to actually understanding what these books have to say and how Kabbalists, through infinite detail, truly understand this symbol, one has to be initiated through, and it's not that secret society initiation, it's just that it's taught orally, It's taught through the spoken word. It's taught through a teacher. So that in itself is still playing to the tradition of before these books were ever even written down, or a lot of them. I don't want to step too far, but anyhow, I wanted to give the context, that if this is a topic of curiosity, if you want more detail when it comes to understanding how Kabbalists want this to be taught, want this to be looked at, in all of the stellar, amazing self-realizations, world realizations, enlightenments that it brandishes, that's there. But I will give some superficial, some overarching themes, but this is by no means a hey, you now understand everything. This is intro. So when it comes to each of these spheres, a part of this tree of life, they are called sephirots, which I mentioned before, meaning sapphires or shinings. This tree of life has been appropriated by several non-kabbalistic traditions. And I'm going to spend my time right now talking about how they interpret it. Now, I know this seems like an off step, but this is an observation of the nature of symbolism. If I talk about the swastika, your mind goes to the Nazis. However, it goes way further back in history than that. It goes back to the Buddhists and beyond. So what is being brought to the image, what is being brought to the symbol, is a worthy observation. I will spend my time talking more of what the Kabbalists believe, but when it comes to a symbol of power and how our minds project meanings into it, says something about ourselves or says something about the traditions that we were brought up in. And talking about these different interpretations from different spiritual traditions gives this even more wondrousness and even more curiosity to even hint towards its highly charged nature. So when it comes to this form of the tree of life, it harkens to the ninefold celestial hierarchy, which is a talk that I gave at the very beginning of this course, in Christianity designating the hierarchy of the angelic forms in the heavens. So that's one way it was appropriated. So, there's the Godhead at the top, there's the seraphim, there's the oraphim, there's the cherubim, there's the middle section, there's the bottom section, the principalities, and so forth. So the ninefold celestial hierarchy, as it was taken into Christian mysticism, it could be viewed, or very literally is, an appropriation of this structure of Kabbalism. So there's that digression. Also, if you really study the Tetractylus in Pythagoreanism, as I've mentioned before in this course, the Tetractylus has a direct correlation with this same form. So you can think of it as them both speaking to the same truth, but different symbols for the same truth. And likewise, in both traditions, as it's mentioned in the Bible, Jacob's ladder. What is Jacob's ladder? And, in multidimensional humanism, this is something that a human soul progresses into different forms of incarnations, ascending their vibrations up until the point where they reach the penultimate or the Godhead or whatever. And that's one new age appropriation of Jacob's ladder. But we could look at it more Kabbalistically and say that this is Jacob's ladder and we are at the very bottom. And that's a very oversimplifying way of looking at it. But this is the ascendancy, that this is the path, this is the ladder to work your way up in through spiritual evolution. So let's start putting a little bit more meat on these non-Kabbalistic interpretations of this tree of life. So there is this aspect of a cosmogeny, a origin story of the universe. And I'm not saying this isn't Kabbalistic, but I'm likely putting details in here that vary from tradition. So don't misinterpret this. But if you look at the symbol and you look at the very top, Keter or Keter, the crown, this is the monad. Allness, nothing but this. Beyond this crown is what is called Ein Sof, or infinity. So the idea is that in this monad, it begins to think. It has a thought of creation. And to do so, and so, okay, let me bring this back a little bit. This is the primordial egg. This is the state of everything before anything. This is complete ether, all potentiality. And it, capital IT, decides to think. And from there, decides to speak. And this willingness to give, to bestow, to outshine, to emanate, to create, was first made possible by Chokmah, which is number 2. And that is the image of the creator. So 1 now just created 2, the image of itself. Because how does the Godhead perceive itself if it does not create an image? Ah, man, this is such tricky stuff. So from that image is completely receiving. And from there is the logos, as mentioned before in this course. And if you need more context, go back to the mystical terminology talk. But in creating this form, that is the masculine form per se. And so we also simultaneously have the feminine form. So the androgynous or hermaphroditic allness aspect split itself into 2 forms and created the emanation of masculine and feminine. So what does that mean? It means the give and the receive. All forms of nature and all things that exist have this fundamental archetype of giving and receiving. So you create both of those forms, and from that, you gestate all the rest. Now, the upper triangle, 1, 2, and 3, is the supernull triangle. It is utterly spiritual. And from this misinterpretation or other understanding, the center, the next 6, that center is the realm of the soul. So spirit is not distinct. It's all inclusive. It's all involved. There are no boundary lines of your beingness. However, the soul can be thought of as a collection of spirit. So it is somewhat distinct. Not fully distinct, but somewhat distinct. And so this middle portion is cooking up the soul. And then lastly, in the very end, is the body, Malkuth, at the very bottom there. And so all of creation was to create a type of, and you could think of this as a battery. You see how it all includes each other. That this all was working its way down with the thought of creation. So what does that mean? The end result would be manifestation or matter or physical form. And again, this is just another interpretation. The thought leads to a word that leads to substance. Okay, let's make this very simple. I have a thought for building a house. So I speak that out and I create a plan. And then I gather a bunch of forces or people or, my own faculties to put together this house. And through a series of steps, I have reached the structure, the creation of this house. And so first came the thought, then the word, then the making. And so that is one way, right, of this symbol being a form or an allegory or a symbol that involves the very act of creation itself. And this ties to something that we've seen reoccurringly in the course too, which is the dismemberment myth. Various spiritual traditions having this trope in their creation story of the god dismembering themselves, of taking apart their body to create the earth, to create the seas, to create the sun, onward and onward and onward. And we also saw already how this symbol ties to the Orphic egg creation story as well. But the difference here is that the Godhead did not kill itself in this thought. It is still complete. It divided aspects of itself. So while it all is itself, it itself is not destroyed in any form. So it meets certain tropes of the dismemberment myth, but it isn't completely accurate. This ties to the Brahmin conception in Hinduism that, the Godhead, the only way that existence can exist is to shatter itself into tons of little fractals, so that all the different aspects of the infinite Godhead can experience itself and itself, like itself as in its singular body and its personhood, along with its other selves, which are other people, other phenomena in nature, and all other matter of matter outside of yourself. And that this is the only way that existence can be, is in the fracturing of the all, is in a fundamental blindness or misunderstanding. And that's the only way that the game could be played, to fool yourself. And for all of existence to be an act of fooling yourself. And this plays into that whole dream interpretation, how, you control all of your dreams, but the only way that it would satisfy you isn't that you make it so that you don't get everything that you want. You make it so that you don't know that you're dreaming. And this is the most proper of all potential ways of living, is to convince yourself that you're not dreaming and that this is all very serious. But okay, I'm going to step away from that a little bit. There's the other, say, misinterpretation or alternate interpretation, non-kabbalistic interpretation, to look at this symbol and project in the planetary bodies and the astronomical, astrological archetypes of those planetary bodies. So Malkuth at the bottom is Earth in this understanding. Yesod in number 9 is the moon. Had, number 8, is Mercury. Netzach over to the right as number 7 is Venus. Tipperet, number 6, is the sun. Gabora is Saturn, and Hesed is Jupiter. And the supernal triangle, yet again, is acting as a spiritual foundation. You can think of this as the very canvas of the universe itself. The very archetypal rules that make any of this even possible. So that lower part of this diagram could be interpreted in this way as a representation of our cosmic alignment. And then there's the thing that they especially tend to distance themselves, the Kabbalists that is that looking at this form, this symbol, as a tie-in to the anatomy. And so this is a rather ham-fisted out of all the interpretations I'm talking about today. But people tend to want to look at this and associate chakras with this form. And, these points of pressure and energetic centers that are around your body. And so Malkuth would be the root chakra, Yasad would be, the sexual chakra, um, Tiphareth, I guess, would be the heart, or where's the solar plexus in that? That's why I'm saying this is ham-fisted. Usually they say Doth, which is not on this diagram, but it's this missing portion in the middle up above number 6, Tiphareth, and below Keter. And they say that's where the pineal gland would be, and that Keter is the crown chakra, obviously, because it's called the crown. But yet again, this is something that tends to be distanced from, but there are very good analogies in Hinduism, in that esotericism, to tie to the fundamental beliefs of Kabbalism. But this one is especially not necessarily well blended, but if it does something for you, hey, have what you may. So the other thing that I think should be really noted here is that between all of these spheres are different paths. All of these sephiros, there's different paths, which there's an understanding of this in Kabbalism, but this ties to tarot. And in tarot, you have different major arcana. You have different trump cards, as it's called. There are 22 different trump cards. And lo and behold, coincidentally, that has something to say about all these paths, right? But it's not just that alone. There's the 22 trumps. There's the 10 sephirot, which are things of themselves, which equal 32. Oh, 32 sounds familiar. One more than that would be 33, tying it in with all sorts of different esoteric traditions, right? As we've discussed before. So if you look at this form as all the paths between the different sephiros, as different archetypes of existence, different things that we experience, okay? Things like closure, things like justice, when we feel justice, right? That's a feeling. When we feel like we've sacrificed, when we feel like we're dying, these are all embodied or symbolized by these different paths. And so every possible emotion, every possible sentiment, every possible phenomenological sensation that one can experience is in this. So it's no accident that you see this, in many ways it's no accident that you see this tied with all manner of occult traditions. As I've already mentioned, tarot, right? I've already mentioned aspects of astrology. Talk about the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucians made it very clear that they had a wisdom that they will not let out, or that they would not let out, until the collective human psyche was ready for it. Does that not sound very similar to the story that I told of Kabbalism to begin with in this talk? And then there's the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, right? In each of these two secret societies, there are two main pieces of the meal, Kabbalism and Hermeticism. And those two are very interestingly tied together. And likewise, Theosophy is going to include interpretations of both. So any secret society you look at will involve Kabbalism in some way, or the fundamental ideas that go along with the study of Kabbalism, and subsequently its sibling or its other shade or its confidant, Hermeticism. So let's start talking about actual Kabbalism here, actual Kabbalism. So I'm going to give some fundamentals, some principles, and tie them to other traditions as well, where we can see their likeness in other traditions. So in Kabbalism, it's worthy of noting that there is no evil. There is just distance from the way. So if a person misuses electricity and it hurts them, if a person misuses a knife and it hurts them, would they blame it for hurting them? All unfortunate and all suffering by this tradition is by not being aligned with the way, And, this sounds resemblant to Taoism, right? And so, contrary to what would become exoteric Christianity, we're already seeing a distinction between Jewish mysticism and exoteric Christianity, right? So it's giving no credence to devils, demons, and these dark, sinister, satanic things, right? The only reason for suffering is a person in denial in a certain way. And also, challengingly enough, Kabbalism talks about reincarnation. And again, this would seem counterintuitive to how it's understood in exoteric Christianity or Abrahamic religions, right? So a person gains wisdom throughout these incarnations and becomes ever more capable of becoming awakened or becoming a Kabbalist. And the distinction here, when we talked about reincarnation before, in Kabbalism, only humans reincarnate. And that reincarnation obeys sex. Men reincarnate as men, women reincarnate as women, So, that kind of lacks some LGBTQ qualities about it. But anyhow, that is the idea here in this idea of reincarnation. And as we've seen, in different tribes in Alaska, that was also a trope of reincarnation following certain sexes or them following certain family lines. I get confused. There are all sorts of deviations and taboos that come along with the same general understanding of the truth of reincarnation. But this is to say that a human will be a human, and you will resemble the same form that you've resembled before. And on my LGBTQ comments and all this, I don't want to talk ill at all of Kabbalism. I love this tradition. I think, gosh, I'm just going to shut myself down. So this body is nothing more than a vessel of the spirit or the soul. And so it changes vessels. It has an ultimate quest, as it was ordained in the very act of creation to begin with. So there's no question here. And you don't go backwards. Each incarnation improves upon itself. So this is a kind of convergent evolution aspect where things will ultimately ever improve. And there's a distinction of two different types of incarnation. So there is, of course, the physical or external reincarnation, of which a person after death will inhabit a different body, a different vessel. But then there is the undermentioned, in most traditions, personal or internal reincarnation, which is the fact that you have died several times in yourself. And I've said it before in this course, the you that you were as a child does not exist if you are an adult. And it doesn't exist. It exists in memory, and it exists in a causal understanding, but you are not that child. You have a whole different personality. You have mutual traits, blah, blah, blah. But your problems as a teenager are not the problems that you have now. That person, that you is no longer. So you have reincarnated in your own body, however many times it's been allowed. And likewise, as another seemingly contradiction to exoteric Christianity, is that this Kabbalism actually has an explanation to where souls come from, right? You barely ever get that in any spiritual traditions. If they go somewhere after, then where did they come from? I mean, you get it in animism, you get it in shamanism far more often, but especially with these later form religions and spiritual traditions, definitely not. Very often unspoken. So in this sense, you know, the souls are all a shattering of the collective atom, uh, original atom, soul, that has been fractured and sent down into Malkuth. And I'm skipping a lot of details there, but the whole idea is to bring these souls back together again. That's the whole act of creation, and the whole act of physical manifestation is to bring these pieces back together. And so this is where I have to start tying in Gnosticism, and why Gnosticism is also tied in with these different secret societies and with Kabbalism. So in Kabbalism, when you are becoming woke, when you're realizing you're attaining enlightenment, you are called a Kabbalist. But when in Gnosticism, this is the gnosis, you know, and then in Buddhism, it's nirvana, right? Um, and in a similar way, if you look at the Gnostic tradition, it's talking about the monad, which is again the allness, as I described before, the bar below, which is the reflection of the allness, the image of the allness, the image of God, the bar below, the pleroma, which is, you know, the endless realm of potentialities, speaking very plainly, which can be thought of as the upper triangle, or even in some ways the middle formation of the soul that I mentioned before. You know, the emanation, the aeon. Sophia could be thought of Bana, which is number 3. How Bana wanted to create like the creator did, and that's why the rest of it was made. How it wanted to create like it saw the original monad creation do. And in Gnosticism, this is how Sophia created the demiurge, which is a deviation, a far deviation from Kabbalism, but it's taking on that same fundamental cosmogeny. Here is my point. You can see the resemblance between these two. And the demiurge creates the archons and creates physical manifestation, and it shouldn't have been blah 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 blah. And another similarity to Gnosticism that you find in Kabbalism is, in Kabbalism you have these different types of life. So there's root life, there's still life, there's vegetative life, there's animated life, and there's speaking. And to break these down quickly, you can think of still life as inanimate and completely lacking of free range. Think of rocks, think of bedrock. They are completely at the whim of what is going on. They can't move themselves. They seemingly don't have an active sentience. And the next step up is animate, which is able to move around and has some independence, you know, animals, but they are at the whim of the collective mind. They, you know, many animals have times where they have to mate. They have certain places that they go at certain times of year. If you look at ants, they're a great analogy for this. They are a part of a cohesive collective mind. So in a very real way, in comparison to humans, and in comparison to humans, they lack a free formness or an independence in comparison to us. And so each step of the way, you're seeing, as it reaches humans, more and more free agency, or the ability to think for oneself. Independence is a very rudimentary way of putting it. But in each of these forms of life, you can see how certain people would fit into these forms of life. You know, for people that are like, they don't think for themselves, they're a part of the group, and they never come up with their own critical thinking. You could tie them in with animate or animal like people, bestial people. And this isn't to dog on anybody, but it's just to say that there are different personalities of human beings, as seeming qualities that correlate to this system of thinking of different life forms. And in Gnosticism, it was a lot more literal. There were sarkic people, which were thought to be ignorant, uninitiated, the lowest level of human thoughts, purely instinctive people. And then there were Hylic people, which were a bit better than Sarkic people, but they were completely materialistic people. And they wouldn't see anything spiritual or be interested in anything spiritual. They would call that hogwash, hooey, and they would much prefer a life of general hedonism and ignorance as it's looked at by them. And then you get into the psychic and the pneumatic, which are the types of people who are capable of achieving gnosis. So you see how these two things, tie together, right? Because in the Kabbalistic conception, there are those that are speaking, and the speaking people have the capability of becoming Kabbalists. So these speaking people, or these pneumatic, or these psychic people, these people that can think for themselves, have critical thinking and a fundamental curiosity, even an existentialism that leads them to a fundamental curiosity, are the evolution of life. It started simple. It started with base matter, amino acids, a singular cell. So why did any of this decide to further complicate itself? It's to improve. That's the idea in both traditions, is that it could have stayed a single cell, but it decided to be a multi-cell. And then it decided to group further and further and further. And now look at us. We have organs. We have various types of cells. We have various, functions that all constitute one being, but yet is a collection of independent beings. Gosh. Ay, ay, ay. So likewise, I've given Gnosticism some time to air out here, but Hermeticism. So a main motif, as many have heard, of Hermeticism is as above, so below, the law of correspondence, as we talked about before in this course. So things apply that are true on all levels, that certain truths, certain principles of the universe are just as true on the microbial, on the quantum level, as they are true on the macrocosm, on the celestial, on the dimensional, on the universal level. They all play by the same rules on different scales. That it takes the form of a fractal. That the more you go in on it, the more it looks exactly like what you just went in on. And so in this way too, Kabbalism, then this symbol that we're looking at, loops in on itself endlessly. There is the form that you see, but then there are forms that exactly resemble this form inside of it. And I would take more time to explain it, but it really is one of those really trippy, mind warping, I don't know, things that endlessly gives more. When you look at what happened in Bana in the Kabbalistic story of cosmogeny, you see that all the rest of the Sephiroth are involved in some way in Bana, and then likewise they're all involved in some way in Netzach number 7. And so, gosh, I can't. I really restrict myself in these talks. I put way too much, and I don't have enough time to talk purely about it. But anyhow, the other ways to break up this fractal, so to speak, is that the different Sephiroths that you see here aren't the only way of approaching Kabbalism. There's also an understanding of 5 different worlds: the Yetzirah, the Asiya, the Azalut, Adam Kadmon, and that all of these are a breaking down into the physical world, like I was explaining earlier. And the initial form was Adam Kadmon, as I've mentioned before in this course, which is pure consciousness, the potential of all beginnings. And the world, in the same way, was created by shattering pure consciousness. So what are we doing on a day-to-day basis, right? How often are you conscious? And you might think of that very superficially, right? Like, I'm breathing, aren't I? But how often are you conscious, right? How often are you really here. And usually that feeling when it's been held off for a long time is kind of like a what am I what am I doing? And so this idea of achieving the Kabbalistic enlightenment or of gnosis or of anything is to bring more and more consciousness, to be more and more present, to be aware of what's going on. What's going on? What's going on? And Malkuth, where we are, or the very bottom of this tree, is the ultimate ego. It is blocking out consciousness. It is blocking out as much consciousness as it can. And it's depicted in the form of true black. And so now we can start to talk about it. We start in ego. This is still, this is inert. And we move up as we start to realize, as we start to internalize, to introspect upon ourselves, to start making connections as to what existence is and what's going on here, you start climbing the ladder. You start moving through the Sephirot. And many people want to look at these different spheres as dimensions. And while there might be something to say about that, all of this is done not necessarily through a plant medicine, psychoactive, astral projecting, but is an internal realization of yourself. Now, if you want to jump into that idea that these are different dimensions, then Yasad is your subconscious. It is where you go when you dream. So if you want that type of thinking, then that is a place you go. That is a map of the psychic network, man. But to really bring this down to basics, what is this symbol? Kabbalists look at this symbol as nothing more, and I've dressed it up in all these fancy interpretations, but it's nothing more than a map of spiritual attainment. It's a roadmap to enlightenment. It is the objective form of all things. All things. All things obey this form. And so then the question is, how do I understand it? Which I'm not here to do. I'm here to introduce you to it. So this, by their mind, by the Kabbalist conception, this is the one objective thing in all of existence. There's a lot of subjectivity. This is non-subjective. And all of this, what is this spiritual enlightenment? What is this enlightenment? It all has to do with one simple statement, or two technically: the will to bestow and the will to receive. So let's break this down a little bit. The ego wants to endlessly take. Endlessly. It is never satiated. It will never have enough. Think of the biggest big boys of politicians or corporate CEOs. Do you think any more money will satiate them? Do you think any more power will satiate them? This is ego. Do you think someone who's hedonistic will ever not get sick of using people? Do you think there'll be enough people used? This is ego. And that is your chronic willingness or yearning to receive. I want it. I want it. I want it. It's mine. It's mine. It's mine. Gimme, gimme, gimme. What's the opposite of that? That is the will to give, or the will to bestow, as it's said. The opposite of that is not what I can get. What can I give? So it's the opposite of ego, altruism. And so the form of this spiritual attainment, the moving up Jacob's ladder, and the way to become a conduit, a vessel, or a part of the Godhead is through becoming like the Godhead. And what does the Godhead do? It endlessly gives. So as an analogy, look at nature. Look at Mother Earth, right? Does it stop giving? And I know you argue, right? In big time in astronomy, the sun will burn out and blah, 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 blah. Really? On your scale, effectively, it is endlessly giving. And even if you want to blow that up further, reality itself, even if you say the big crunch is going to happen, blah, 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 what's to say it's not going to go on? Endlessly giving. The earth is giving food. It's giving life. It's giving a home, all the materials in the home. And on the screen that you're looking at, all the materials in that, it's all been given from here. It's endlessly giving. And what do you give? What do you give to it? And so it's this realization of what can I give? How can I give, instead of this chronic loop of trying to get. And so that's the real thing that's going on here. You in the Kabbalistic perspective is that you might look at this symbol and do all these heady things like we've done today, right? We can go on about how the initial monad created an emanation of which, created the pleroma and achieved density through yada, 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 right? And we can look at it and then, start to hypothesize about the form of the, solar system and blah, blah, blah. All these things don't matter. Ultimately, what the Kabbalist wants to be fixated upon is this: the will to bestow, the will to receive. And so, if you're interested in that, go beyond and keep looking at this. Like I said, I'll have links in the description. But in this way too, this form archetypally is you. You have all of these aspects, or you have the potential of all of these aspects. And likewise, this form is also what is outside of you. It's also the macrocosm. So in this way, and like in Hermeticism too, if you fix you, you fix everything. A lot of problems are a matter of how you think about it, right? Things that you thought would be endless, miseries that you thought would be endless, like a breakup, right? It changed. How did it change? The world didn't really change. What changed was your perspective. So how do you do that? How do you change perspective? You fix you fix everything. That it will all work itself out. And you don't have to go out there and pioneer, social justice warrior style, And sure, there are things to be done. I'm not discrediting that, but the focus is you fix you, which we don't like that. We like to think we're all done, we're all complete, and we're just going to shine to everybody else. So in some closing notes, right? In this way, as we talked about, this is the tree of life. This is the tree of life by this understanding, right? And that as it works its way down, it creates the physical manifestation that we call life. And on the way up, as you shed ego, as you move through the different paths, as you attain an understanding and move through the illusions of the different setarot, this becomes also the tree of knowledge, that it's one and the same, that all knowledge is within the understanding of this very diagram itself. So hope this has served as a good introduction. Take it for what you will. And we will refer back to this in the sessions to come.